She came to Riverside Park for a moment of peace, but her quiet evening took an unexpected turn when an overly familiar police officer approached her. What unfolded next will challenge everything you thought about justice. Watch until the end to see how this gripping encounter unravels. Don't forget to subscribe for more thought-provoking stories and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? The day was fading into a warm, tranquil evening, and the golden sun bathed Cedarwood Park in a soft orange glow. Families strolled along the meandering paths, their laughter mingling with the chirping of birds. A young woman, Sophia, sat quietly on a wooden bench, enjoying the stillness of her surroundings. This park was Sophia's escape, a sanctuary from the constant demands of her bustling life. Today was one of the rare moments she could simply sit and take in the world. Dressed in a light, flowing dress with a delicate scarf draped over her shoulders, her loose curls framed her face as she leaned back, taking a deep breath. The breeze carried with it the scent of blooming flowers, and Sophia let herself relax completely. The worries of her day melted away with each passing second. For Sophia, this was a rare gift, an uninterrupted moment of solace. Her thoughts drifted to her husband Ethan, who was finishing his shift at the nearby police station. Ethan, a highly respected captain, was known for his unyielding sense of justice and commitment to integrity. Despite the long hours his role demanded, he always made time for Sophia. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and unwavering support for one another. Sophia glanced at her phone, debating whether to send Ethan a quick text to let him know she was waiting for him at the park. Just as she reached for her phone, a shadow fell across her. Startled, she looked up to see a tall man in a police uniform standing before her. "Good evening," he said, his tone smooth but overly casual. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Sophia nodded politely, a small, cautious smile forming on her lips. "Yes, it is." The name on his badge read Officer Reed. Instead of moving on, he lowered himself onto the bench, sitting closer than Sophia was comfortable with. His eyes lingered on hers, studying her with an intensity that felt intrusive. Sophia shifted slightly, hoping he would take the hint and leave, but Officer Reed didn't budge. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with a subtle undertone that made Sophia uneasy. She hesitated, her eyes darting briefly around the park as she searched for an escape from the situation. She didn't want to appear rude. After all, he was an officer. "Sometimes," she replied evenly. "It's a nice place to unwind." Reed nodded, though his gaze never wavered. In fact, his attention seemed to grow more intent. "You know," he said, leaning slightly closer, "it's not every day I meet someone like you." Sophia stiffened. The comment, though framed as a compliment, unsettled her. She forced a light laugh, hoping to diffuse the awkward tension. "I'm sure you meet plenty of people in your work." Reed chuckled, lowering his voice. "Not like you." He rested his hand casually on the bench near Sophia's leg. A chill crawled up her spine as she noticed his fingers edging closer to her knee. Sophia shifted subtly, trying to create space between them. But her movement only seemed to embolden him. His hand followed, brushing lightly against her knee. Sophia's body tensed, realizing he wasn't backing off. "Excuse me," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the awkward air. "I'm waiting for my husband." Officer Reed raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, I didn't mean to intrude," he said smoothly, yet he didn't move his hand. Instead, it grew more persistent, sliding along her leg. Sophia snapped. She pulled away sharply, her voice growing more commanding. "I said I'm waiting for my husband." The smile on Reed's face vanished, replaced by a cold, menacing look. The friendliness in his demeanor dissolved into something far more sinister. His grip on her knee tightened for a brief, alarming second before he finally withdrew his hand, only to place it firmly on her shoulder. Without warning, he shoved her hard. Sophia hit the ground with a thud, the impact sending a jolt of pain through her wrist and shoulder. Her mind reeled, trying to process what had just happened. She pushed herself up, her arm throbbing as she looked up at Reed. He now stood over her, his face twisted in frustration and anger, his chest heaving as he struggled to maintain control. Just then, a voice rang out across the park path. "Sophia!" She turned her head, relief washing over her like a tidal wave as she saw Ethan approaching. His eyes widened at the scene before him. "Sophia," bruised and disheveled, sitting on the ground and Reed towering over her. In an instant, Ethan's composed demeanor gave way to fury. His voice was sharp, commanding. "What the hell is going on here?" Reed took a step back, his face hardening as he locked eyes with Ethan. But rather than showing recognition or remorse, Reed's expression twisted with suspicion. "Sir, this is a private matter," he said dismissively, waving Ethan off. "Move along." Ethan's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm, his anger simmering just below the surface. His voice dropped, low and threatening. "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." Reed's expression didn't waver. He sneered, stepping closer to Ethan. "I don't care who you are," he said coldly. "Interfering with an officer's duty is a serious offense." Sophia, still sitting on the ground, winced as she tried to get up, the pain in her arm making it difficult. She could only watch as the tension between the two men escalated. Ethan's gaze flicked to her briefly, taking in her injuries. His fists tightened at his sides, his body vibrating with restrained anger. But Reed, misreading Ethan's controlled demeanor as hesitation, grew bolder. "You need to step back," Reed barked, his hand moving to his radio. "I'm calling for backup." Sophia's heart raced as she saw Reed's hand reach for his radio. She wanted to scream, to plead with him to stop, but fear kept her frozen. Reed's voice was sharp as he reported a disruptive civilian interfering with police matters, the words dripping with manipulation. Ethan's expression shifted. The cold determination in his eyes grew steely, his patience worn thin. He was done playing along, done trying to de-escalate. But before he could respond, a distant siren pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Sophia's breath hitched as a patrol car pulled up. Backup had arrived. The new officers stepped out, their faces a mix of confusion as they surveyed the scene. A man standing tall and unyielding, a woman injured and shaken, and an officer exuding false confidence. Reed gestured toward Ethan, his smirk returning. "Arrest him," he ordered. The officers hesitated, exchanging unsure glances. But after a tense moment, they moved toward Ethan, ready to follow orders. Sophia watched in horror as they surrounded her husband, grabbing his arms roughly. "Wait." Ethan tried to explain, his voice steady but firm. The officers ignored him, pushing him down with unnecessary force. Sophia's blood ran cold as she watched helplessly, her heart pounding in her chest. All the while, Reed stood to the side, his smile cruel and smug, clearly reveling in the chaos he had orchestrated. The evening that began so peacefully was now spiraling into darkness, leaving Sophia and Ethan caught in the crossfire of Reed's abuse of power. All the while, Reed loomed over the scene, his twisted smile deepening as he reveled in the chaos he had orchestrated. Sophia's world seemed to crumble. Her wrist throbbed painfully, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest as she watched Ethan, the man she loved and respected, treated like a criminal. Her thoughts flashed back to Ethan as she knew him, a man of calm strength and unwavering principles. As a captain in the police force, he commanded respect and upheld justice with integrity. It was this steadfast sense of responsibility that had earned him the admiration of his colleagues and the trust of his community. But now, seeing him brought to his knees while she lay bruised and vulnerable on the ground, Sophia's hope teetered on the edge of despair. "Sophia!" Ethan's voice had called out to her moments ago, full of concern and urgency as he rushed to her side. He had gently helped her to her feet, his eyes scanning her with worry. "Are you okay?" he had asked, his tone tight with anger that he struggled to keep under control. Sophia had winced, cradling her sore wrist. I'm fine," she had managed, though her voice had trembled. "That officer, he—" Ethan's gaze had hardened as he turned toward Reed, who stood just a few steps away with arms crossed and a condescending smirk on his face. Despite what had just happened, Reed seemed unfazed by Ethan's presence or Sophia's clear distress. "What's going on here?" Ethan demanded, his voice even but edged with barely restrained fury. Reed didn't flinch. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Sir, this is a private matter," he said dismissively, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Move along." Ethan had stared at him, momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity of the officer's response. He was accustomed to being recognized by his peers, especially within law enforcement, and the blatant lack of respect caught him off guard. But it wasn't just that. Seeing Sophia injured, knowing she had been hurt by someone meant to protect, sparked a rage in Ethan that he hadn't felt in years. "You don't know who you're talking to," Ethan said slowly, his voice low and laced with warning. His mind raced, weighing his options. He knew escalation wouldn't help, but his protective instincts screamed at him to act. Reed didn't back down. If anything, he grew more defiant. "Oh, I don't care who you are," he sneered, his voice brimming with contempt. "Interfering with an officer's duty is a serious offense." Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. The weight of his authority bore down on him, the responsibility of maintaining composure, of doing the right thing, even when confronted with blatant injustice. His eyes flicked to Sophia, who stood clutching her injured wrist. The pain on her face tore at him, fueling his fury. But he knew that for her sake, he had to remain steady. Sophia's eyes brimmed with worry and pain as she stood beside her husband Ethan, who was staring down Officer Harris with a dangerous calm. "Is that so?" Ethan said, his voice low and steady, stepping closer to Harris. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you just assaulted my wife." For a brief moment, Harris's confidence faltered, his expression flickering with uncertainty. But he quickly regained his composure, scoffing. "Your wife? Well, maybe she should have been a bit friendlier," he replied, his gaze sliding back to Sophia with a look that made Ethan's fists clench. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew that escalating the situation could make things worse. Yet Harris had crossed a line, one that Ethan couldn't ignore. Before Ethan could respond, Harris reached for his radio, lifting it to his lips with deliberate intent. "Backup requested at Brookside Park," he said sharply, his voice oozing authority. "We've got a disruptive civilian refusing to comply." Ethan's heart sank. Harris was manipulating the situation, twisting it to paint himself as the victim while escalating the conflict. Sophia tugged gently at Ethan's arm, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please don't let him do this." Ethan turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I won't," he promised, though the weight of that promise pressed heavily on him. Minutes passed in tense silence until the wail of sirens broke through the stillness of the park. 2 patrol cars arrived, screeching to a halt along the winding path. Several officers stepped out, their faces etched with confusion as they took in the scene. Ethan, calm yet visibly tense, Sophia, shaken and holding her injured wrist, and Harris, standing with a smug expression of authority. "There he is," Harris declared, pointing at Ethan with a smirk. "Arrest him." The officers exchanged hesitant glances, clearly unsure of the situation. Their confusion deepened when they caught a glimpse of the badge clipped to Ethan's belt. It glinted subtly under his jacket, a stark contrast to the accusation Harris had just made. Still, Harris's commanding tone pushed them into action. The officers moved toward Ethan, their steps reluctant but resolute. "Sir, we need you to step back," one officer said, though his voice lacked conviction. Ethan held up his hands, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "Do you even know who I am?" he asked, his voice calm yet tinged with irony. Harris laughed, the sound mocking. "Oh, we don't care who you are, buddy. Interfering with an officer on duty is a crime." Sophia's heart raced as she watched, her mind a storm of disbelief. She wanted to shout the truth, to tell the officers exactly who Ethan was, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. One of the officers grabbed Ethan's arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. "Hey, take it easy," Ethan said sharply, his voice controlled. He didn't resist, knowing that any sign of aggression would only give them an excuse to escalate further. The officers ignored his words, wrenching his other arm back before snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Sophia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched the man she loved, the man who had dedicated his life to justice, being treated like a criminal. Tears burned her eyes, but she remained frozen, unable to intervene. The officers shoved Ethan to his knees, his badge and words dismissed as irrelevant. All the while Harris stood off to the side, his arms crossed and a twisted smile on his face. "Maybe next time," Harris sneered, "you'll learn to stay out of things that don't concern you." One of the officers pushed Ethan forward, forcing him down onto the ground. The scene was a brutal contradiction of everything Ethan believed in, and yet it was only the beginning. Ethan's cheek pressed against the rough pavement, his jaw clenched tightly. His body radiated with frustration and humiliation, but he refused to give Officer Harris the satisfaction of seeing him break. As the officers finished restraining him, Harris leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. "This is what happens when people like you forget their place." The words hung in the air, dripping with contempt. Ethan's fists tightened against the cuffs as his anger surged. He wanted nothing more than to retaliate, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew that losing control would only make things worse. Sophia, finding her voice at last, took a shaky step forward. "Please stop this," she cried, her voice trembling with desperation. "He's the captain of the police force. He's one of you." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officers ignored her completely, focused only on their task. They yanked Ethan to his feet, his wrists bound tightly behind him. He stumbled slightly under the rough treatment, his body aching from the ordeal, but he kept his head high. Harris watched it all unfold, a sick satisfaction plastered across his face. As Ethan was dragged toward the patrol car, Harris turned to Sophia, his expression smug. "Looks like you'll be waiting a while," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Better get comfortable." Sophia's hands trembled with rage and helplessness as she watched the officers shove Ethan into the back seat, slamming the door shut behind him. The sound echoed like a final insult, breaking her heart. She felt powerless against the cruelty and corruption on full display. As the car pulled away, Harris lingered, giving her one last triumphant smirk before turning and strolling back down the park path. He left Sophia standing there, her hopes shattered and her heart aching. But in that moment, a fire ignited within her. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Sophia vowed then and there that she wouldn't stop fighting until Ethan was free and Harris was brought to justice. Inside the patrol car, Ethan stared out the window as the vehicle sped through the quiet streets. Sophia's voice still rang in his ears, her desperate plea cutting deeper than any physical pain. His humiliation was sharp, but his concern for her safety weighed even heavier. The officers in the front exchanged glances, the tension between them palpable. Officer Grant adjusted the radio on his dashboard, deliberately avoiding looking at Ethan through the rearview mirror. The silence in the car felt suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the distant sounds of the city. Finally, Officer Miller turned slightly in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Look, if you'd just stayed out of it, none of this would have happened," he muttered as though trying to rationalize their actions. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He wanted to lash out, to tell them exactly how their blind loyalty to Harris had led them astray. But he held back, knowing that saying anything now would only give them an excuse to escalate further. Instead, he bit down on his frustration, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the passing city lights. As they approached the precinct, the weight of what had happened settled heavily in Ethan's chest. The officers might have silenced him for now, but they hadn't extinguished his resolve. Ethan was no stranger to the concept of the Blue Code, a bond among officers to trust and protect each other. But tonight, that bond had been weaponized, twisted into a tool of corruption and injustice. The patrol car pulled into the underground parking garage of the Greenridge Police Precinct. Ethan braced himself as the vehicle came to a halt. The doors opened, and Officer Miller yanked him roughly from the car, the cold steel of the cuffs biting into his wrists. The cement floor beneath his feet was unforgiving as Ethan stumbled, struggling to regain his balance. Officer Grant approached from the side, his eyes deliberately avoiding Ethan's, fixed instead somewhere over his shoulder. The avoidance cut deep. These were supposed to be his colleagues, officers sworn to uphold justice, yet here they were, treating him like a common criminal. Without a word, they led him down a dimly lit hallway, away from the main booking station. Ethan's unease deepened with each step as they veered into a rarely used, isolated section of the building. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with suspicion. Miller shot him a cold glance, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "You'll see soon enough. Don't worry, we'll make sure you're comfortable." At the end of the hallway, they stopped in front of a metal door. Grant unlocked it and shoved Ethan inside with little care for the force he used. The room was bare, small, dimly lit, and unsettling. A single chair bolted to the floor stood in the center, the only furniture in the space. Miller forced Ethan into the chair, securing the cuffs to a metal loop attached to the armrests. Immobilized, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He glanced around the room, his breath catching as realization dawned. This wasn't a standard holding cell. It was a space designed for intimidation, a place where officers could isolate individuals they deemed troublesome. Minutes stretched into agonizing eternity as Ethan sat alone in tense silence. The cold metal bit into his wrists, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in on him, amplifying every thought and fear. Finally, the door creaked open. Officer Harris stepped in, his face painted with a smug expression of triumph. He crossed his arms, standing tall as he looked down at Ethan, his twisted smile exuding satisfaction. "Well, look who's on the wrong side of the law," Harris sneered, circling the chair slowly. Ethan met his gaze, his voice calm yet simmering with barely restrained anger. "You're making a mistake, Harris. This won't end the way you think it will." Harris let out a cold laugh. "I don't think you understand, Captain. This is my precinct, my rules. And right now, you're just another criminal who thought he could get away with disrespecting an officer." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I've been waiting for someone like you to cross the line, someone who thinks they're untouchable because of a fancy title." Ethan's jaw tightened as Harris's words dug into him. Anger simmered beneath the surface, each taunt pushing him closer to the edge. But he refused to give Harris the satisfaction of a reaction. Harris's smug smile faltered as Ethan remained unflinching, his silence denying Harris the power he craved. The officer's expression twisted into a scowl. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you?" Harris spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Ethan's resolve remained firm, knowing that any sign of weakness would only feed Harris's sadistic need for control. "You're nothing in here," Harris spat, leaning in until his face was uncomfortably close to Ethan's. "You're just another troublemaker who needs to be taught a lesson." With sudden and brutal force, Harris grabbed Ethan by the collar, yanking him forward in the chair until their faces were mere inches apart. Ethan could feel Harris's hot breath and see the malice burning in his eyes. "You're going to regret ever crossing me," Harris hissed, his voice low and venomous. He shoved Ethan back into the chair, the impact jarring and painful. Ethan gritted his teeth, his wrists chafing against the metal cuffs, biting into his skin. Despite the pain and the humiliation, he held his composure, refusing to give Harris the reaction he was so clearly seeking. Just then, the door creaked open. Two more officers entered the room, their expressions tense and uncomfortable. They hesitated for a moment before Harris gave them a curt nod, a silent command that sent them into action. The officers approached Ethan, their faces grim as they began a rough and invasive search. Their actions, far removed from standard protocol, were designed to assert dominance. They patted him down with unnecessary force, shoving him around in the process. Ethan clenched his jaw, enduring the rough handling in silence. His body ached from their aggression, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He fixed his gaze on the wall, focusing on anything but the indignities being inflicted upon him. Harris watched from the corner, arms crossed and a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "See, Captain," he said mockingly, "this is what happens when you forget your place. You end up here, with nothing but a cell to remind you that you're no better than the people you look down on." Ethan forced himself to remain calm, even as Harris's words hit deep. The twisted irony of being treated like a criminal by those he had once trusted gnawed at him. The betrayal of his comrades, men he had believed shared his dedication to justice, was a bitter pill to swallow. But he couldn't afford to let his anger cloud his judgment. Ethan knew he needed to stay sharp, to remember every detail of what was happening. One day, he would expose Harris for what he truly was. When the officers finally stepped back, they looked to Harris for further instructions. Harris, clearly pleased with himself, gave a slow, approving nod. "Let's leave him here for a while," Harris said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Give him some time to think about his actions." With one last mocking glance, Harris strode out of the room, the two officers following close behind. The door closed with a resounding click, leaving Ethan alone in the cold, dimly lit room. The minutes stretched into hours. The oppressive silence of the room amplified the ache in Ethan's body and the weight of his thoughts. But instead of breaking his resolve, the solitude sharpened it. He replayed the events of the day over and over in his mind, each detail sharpening his focus and solidifying his purpose. He thought of Sophia, of the fear in her eyes as she had watched him taken away. That memory fueled his determination. Harris had underestimated him, underestimated how far Ethan was willing to go to fight for justice. Sitting in that small, suffocating room, Ethan made a vow. He would see this through, no matter the cost. He would bring the truth to light, and when that day came, he would be ready. Ethan sat in the back seat of the patrol car, his hands still cuffed, his expression calm, but his mind racing. He stared out the window, forcing himself to focus and gather his strength for what lay ahead. In the front seat, Officers Grant and Miller exchanged uneasy glances. The tension between them was palpable, though neither dared to speak. They avoided looking at Ethan directly, their discomfort evident. They might not have fully understood the extent of Harris's vendetta, but they knew he was pushing boundaries, and by following his orders, they had made themselves complicit. As the car sped down the quiet streets, both officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to confront the growing weight of their actions. Ethan became acutely aware of the bruises forming on his wrists from the tight cuffs and the dull ache in his shoulder from the earlier rough treatment. He shifted slightly, trying to ease the discomfort, but the small motion only seemed to heighten the tension in the car. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked sharply, his tone cutting through the silence. "Feeling guilty?" Neither officer answered, but he noticed Grant's hands tighten on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. Miller let out a heavy sigh, almost as if he wanted to speak, but lacked the courage. Leaning forward as far as his restraints allowed, Ethan's voice dropped, calm yet filled with contempt. "Do you even understand what you're doing? Following orders? No questions asked? Even when you know it's wrong?" Grant's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, meeting Ethan's gaze for a fleeting second before quickly looking away. Miller shifted in his seat, his posture tense. He turned slightly, casting a defensive look in Ethan's direction. "Listen," Miller muttered, his tone guarded. "This wouldn't be happening if you just stayed out of it. You had to push it. Make a scene." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Making a scene? Is that what you call protecting my wife from an officer who crossed the line?" Miller's face twisted in discomfort, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned back around, staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. In the driver's seat, Grant's grip on the wheel tightened even further, his struggle to maintain composure evident. The silence that followed was heavy, but Ethan could sense the small cracks in their loyalty. They might have followed Harris's orders, but they weren't entirely blind to the lines he was crossing. Ethan decided to press further, hoping to widen those cracks. "You both know this isn't right," he said, his tone firm but not accusatory. "You're police officers. You swore to protect and serve, not to blindly obey orders that go against everything that badge stands for." Grant's jaw tightened as he kept his eyes fixed on the road. Miller turned slightly again, his glare hardened, though he avoided meeting Ethan's eyes for long. His defensiveness was clear, but so was his unease. As the precinct came into view, the tension in the car became suffocating. Ethan knew that once they arrived, the real challenge would begin. Harris had made his intentions clear. He was determined to make an example out of Ethan, stripping him of his dignity and authority in the most humiliating way possible. The car pulled into the precinct parking lot, and Grant and Miller stepped out, their movements stiff with forced indifference. Circling around to Ethan's door, they yanked him out roughly, their faces hardened with an air of detachment. As they led Ethan inside, the curious glances from a few officers who recognized him did nothing to soften their resolve. The air in the precinct was charged, the tension almost unbearable. Ethan's focus sharpened. He knew that every step forward brought him closer to the moment he would expose the truth. Ethan was guided through the hallway by Grant and Miller, their grips on his arms unrelenting. They stopped at an elevator at the end of the corridor. As they stepped inside, Miller pressed the button for the basement, avoiding Ethan's questioning gaze. The choice of location was clear. It was deliberate. The basement was isolated, away from prying eyes. It was evident that Harris had planned every step to ensure control and prevent interference. The elevator descended, and the silence between them grew heavy, almost suffocating. When the doors finally opened, they stepped into a dimly lit corridor. The air was stale and oppressive, carrying a sense of abandonment. This part of the precinct was rarely used, primarily reserved for storage or private interrogations. It was the perfect setting for Harris's scheme. Ethan was led down the corridor to a small, unmarked room. Miller unlocked the door and shoved him inside with unnecessary force. The room was stark and bare, with only a single metal chair bolted to the floor under a dim overhead light. The weak glow cast harsh shadows on the cold cement walls. Ethan was forced into the chair, his cuffs secured to the armrests, immobilizing him. Grant and Miller stepped back, their faces unreadable, as they positioned themselves near the door. Ethan glanced around, taking in the claustrophobic space. The cold metal of the chair bit into his skin, his body aching from the bruises and restraints. Despite the pain, he forced himself to remain calm, focusing on the bigger picture, the endgame. Time dragged on, each minute stretching endlessly. The oppressive silence only heightened Ethan's tension. Finally, the door creaked open, and Harris strode in. "Well, well," Harris sneered, crossing his arms as he circled the chair. "You thought you could interfere with an officer's work and walk away unscathed, didn't you?" Ethan met Harris's gaze, his eyes steady and cold. "If by work you mean harassing an innocent woman, then yes, I had every right to step in." Harris's smirk vanished, his face twisting with anger. He stepped closer, leaning down until their faces were just inches apart. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long," Harris hissed, "thinking you're above the law. But here in my station, you're nothing. Just another criminal who needs to learn his place." Ethan held Harris's gaze, his silence unbroken. He knew any reaction would only feed Harris's ego, and he refused to give him that satisfaction. Straightening, Harris's cruel smile returned. He turned to Grant and Miller, issuing a sharp command. "Teach him a lesson he won't forget." The two officers exchanged uneasy glances, hesitation clear in their eyes. But under Harris's cold, expectant stare, they complied. Grant was the first to act, his fist connecting with Ethan's jaw. The blow was forceful, snapping Ethan's head to the side. A metallic taste filled his mouth as blood trickled from a cut on his lip. Ethan gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out. Miller delivered the next blow, driving his fist into Ethan's ribs. Pain rippled through his torso, each punch amplifying the bruises already forming under his skin. Despite the onslaught, Ethan's resolve remained unshaken. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Harris stood in the corner, arms crossed, his eyes gleaming with twisted satisfaction. "Let this be a reminder," he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "No one is above the law, not even you, Captain." Ethan forced his focus inward, his mind racing even as he endured the brutal attack. He knew Harris wanted him to beg, to crumble. But Ethan wouldn't give him that victory. He would endure, for Sophia, for the people who looked to him as a leader, and for the truth that would one day come to light. When the beating finally stopped, Ethan slumped in the chair. His vision blurred, his breathing labored, but his spirit remained intact. Ethan's body ached from the relentless beating, but his spirit remained unbroken. If anything, his resolve had only grown stronger. Harris stepped forward, leaning down to whisper into Ethan's ear, his voice dripping with malice. "This is just the beginning, Captain. You think you're walking out of here? You'll be lucky if you ever see daylight again." Straightening, Harris gave a curt nod to Grant and Miller before walking out of the room, leaving Ethan alone in the stifling silence. Time dragged on, each second stretching painfully as Ethan sat slumped in the cold, unyielding chair. His wrists, chafed raw by the cuffs, throbbed, and his body bore the brunt of the assault. The small room felt like a cage, suffused with the weight of injustice and cruelty inflicted by those who should have been his allies. But as the hours passed, a fire began to burn within him. Despite the pain, he knew he had to endure. Justice wasn't just for him, it was for Sophia, for every victim of Harris's corrupt authority. He would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The creak of the door pulled Ethan from his thoughts. Harris entered, his expression smug as he leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed. "Feeling humbled yet, Captain?" Harris sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Or should I say former Captain?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching, though every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his battered body. He refused to give Harris the satisfaction of seeing him weakened. "You really think this will stay hidden, Harris?" Ethan replied, his voice low and steady. "You think no one will find out about the abuse you've inflicted here?" Harris laughed, the sound cold and dismissive. "You're delusional, Ethan. No one's going to care about a disruptive civilian who stepped out of line. Your days of hiding behind that badge are over." But as Harris spoke, his confidence wavered. He noticed the unyielding defiance in Ethan's eyes. Defiance that remained undiminished despite the bruises and exhaustion. That steadfast gaze was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Harris's mind. Clearing his throat as if to regain his composure, Harris straightened. At that moment the door opened again. One of the officers who had accompanied him earlier entered, his expression tense and conflicted. The officer cast a quick, uncertain glance at Harris before addressing him directly. "Sir," he began, his voice hesitant, "I think there's something you need to see." Harris frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to speak in front of Ethan. "It's about the footage from outside the precinct." Harris's face paled slightly, and Ethan noticed a flicker of fear flash across his eyes before he quickly masked it. "What footage?" Harris demanded, his voice sharp and filled with irritation. The officer glanced at Ethan, then back at Harris, lowering his voice as if to keep the matter discreet. "Someone, one of the bystanders, recorded a video. It's gone viral. People are demanding answers. The footage is spreading fast, and it shows everything. Everything that happened between you and his wife." The words landed like a hammer, the tension in the room thickening with every syllable. Harris's face twisted with anger, his fists clenching as he struggled to process the revelation. "What exactly is on the footage?" he asked through gritted teeth, his tone betraying the cracks in his composure. Ethan watched silently, his steady gaze never wavering. He knew that the tide was beginning to turn. The officer hesitated, casting another uncertain glance at Ethan. His voice was low but firm. It shows you assaulting the woman, sir, and other officers arresting her husband without provocation. The public's outraged. They're calling for an investigation. We've got journalists asking for statements, and social media is exploding with demands for accountability." Harris's face drained of color as he processed the information. The cracks in his once unshakable composure deepened. For the first time, Ethan saw genuine fear in his eyes. Harris's carefully constructed authority was crumbling, the truth he had worked so hard to bury now clawing its way into the light. Ethan remained stoic, though he felt a spark of satisfaction. He watched in silence as Harris's confidence unraveled, his twisted grip on control slipping through his fingers. "You're finished, Harris," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady and calm but filled with quiet conviction. "No more lies, no more hiding. Everyone will see you for who you truly are." Harris's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening in an attempt to mask his growing panic. "Don't think this changes anything, Captain," he hissed, though his voice trembled ever so slightly. "I still have the power to ruin you. One piece of footage isn't enough to save you." Even as he spoke, the desperation in his tone betrayed the truth. He knew he was losing his grip. The officer, visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "There's one more thing, sir," he said, drawing Harris's attention. "The chief wants to see you in his office immediately. He's seen the footage too." The words hit Harris like a blow. He froze, staring at the officer in shock before quickly regaining his composure. Straightening, he turned to Ethan, his face contorted with cold hatred. "This isn't over," Harris spat before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Left alone with the officer, Ethan met his gaze. There was a flicker of uncertainty in the man's eyes, an internal struggle between his loyalty to the department and the dawning realization of the corruption he had witnessed. Ethan's voice was steady as he spoke. "You still have a choice. Do the right thing." The officer hesitated for a long moment, then gave a small, reluctant nod. He stepped forward and unlocked Ethan's cuffs. Relief washed over Ethan as the cold metal restraints were removed, allowing blood to flow freely through his wrists again. He flexed his hands, wincing at the rawness of his skin. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, meeting the officer's gaze. The officer looked away, visibly uncomfortable, but there was a shared understanding in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement of the moral line that had been crossed. As Ethan stepped out of the room, his heart pounded with a mixture of relief and anticipation. The tide was turning. The truth was finally surfacing. Though the road ahead would be long and difficult, he was ready. Harris's grip on power was weakening, and justice was now within reach. The following morning, a heavy stillness hung over the Greenridge precinct. It was an unusual quiet, laden with tension. Officers moved cautiously, casting wary glances toward the chief's office, where a closed-door meeting was taking place. Word of the incident had spread like wildfire, filling the hallways with hushed whispers. Tension painted every face, a collective sense of anticipation rippling through the building like a storm about to break. Ethan, now free from the holding room, sat in a small waiting area. He could feel the charged atmosphere settling over the precinct. The whispers, the glances, the unease in the air, they all pointed to one undeniable fact. Change was coming. Moments later, the next chapter in the battle for justice was about to unfold. The door to the chief's office swung open, and Harris stepped out. His face was pale, his expression rigid and stony. Behind him, the chief stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze sweeping over the officers gathered nearby. "Harris is suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation," the chief announced, his voice firm and resonant, leaving no room for doubt. The words hung heavily in the air like a final verdict. Officers exchanged shocked glances, murmurs rippling through the precinct as they processed the gravity of the situation. Ethan watched from a distance, his jaw tightening, but inside, his heart lifted. Justice was finally catching up to Harris. All the humiliation and pain Ethan had endured had led to this moment, a turning point where the truth was beginning to prevail. The chief's voice silenced the whispers. "I want everyone in this precinct to understand," he said, his tone commanding. "We will not tolerate abuse of power, corruption, or any form of discrimination within our ranks. We are here to uphold the law, not to twist it for personal gain." Harris, visibly shaken, avoided the chief's gaze as two officers approached to escort him out of the building. He muttered angry protests, struggling weakly against them, but the weight of his actions left him powerless. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by the harsh reality that his reign of fear was over. As Harris passed Ethan, his face contorted with bitterness. "This isn't over, Ethan," he hissed. But the conviction that once laced his threats was now hollow. Ethan met his glare with calm resolve, his voice steady as he replied, "No, Harris, for you, it is." The officers led Harris out, his departure observed by the very people who had once feared him. They now watched with a mixture of relief and lingering shock. The precinct had witnessed many moments of turmoil, but this one carried the weight of change and accountability. Once the commotion settled, the chief approached Ethan, his expression softening. "Captain Ethan Carter?" he said, nodding slightly. "I'm sorry for everything you've endured. An internal investigation is already underway, and I assure you that justice will be served." Ethan nodded in gratitude, the sincerity of his response evident despite the ache in his body. He understood the significance of the chief's words. They weren't mere platitudes, but a commitment to rectifying the wrongs that had been done. The chief gestured for Ethan to follow him back into his office. Inside, the air was charged with a mix of solemnity and camaraderie. There was a mutual respect, forged through the crucible of recent events. "Ethan," the chief began, his tone more personal, "this department owes you a debt. What happened will not go unanswered. Harris's actions, along with those of any officers who enabled him, will be thoroughly investigated." "Thank you, Chief," Ethan replied, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the past day. "I only wanted to ensure that this department stands for what is right. Abuse of power cannot and should not be ignored." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "We'll also be implementing new measures to make sure this never happens again. Mandatory training on ethics and bias, psychological evaluations, and more transparent protocols. These changes are overdue, but they're essential to rebuilding the trust Harris tried to destroy." Relief surged through Ethan as he listened to the chief's plans. The steps being taken would not only address the immediate damage, but also protect others from similar injustices in the future. His ordeal had been grueling, but the reforms it inspired would have a lasting impact. The chief placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Take the time you need to recover, Captain. You've been through hell, and we want you back when you're ready." Ethan nodded again, the gratitude in his expression unmistakable. "Thank you, Chief." As he left the office, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The system that Harris had abused was now turning against him, and steps were being taken to restore integrity and fairness. Ethan's pain wasn't for nothing. It had sparked meaningful change, and the precinct, once shadowed by corruption, was beginning its journey toward reform. Outside, Ethan spotted Sophia waiting for him. Her face lit up with relief as soon as she saw him, and she rushed forward, wrapping him in a tight embrace. The warmth of her arms, the steady reassurance of her presence, felt like a balm to his battered spirit. Sophia pulled back slightly, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and love. "I knew you'd make it through," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you'd bring the truth to light." Ethan smiled, gently resting his hand on her cheek. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied softly. "Knowing you were waiting for me kept me strong." They stood together in the morning light, a testament to resilience and justice. Two people who had weathered a storm and emerged stronger than ever. Ethan knew the battle for accountability and integrity within the force wasn't over, but today was a victory. A hard-fought triumph over those who had abused their power. As they walked away from the Greenridge precinct, side by side, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought for what was right, and though there would always be challenges ahead, he was ready to face them. Knowing he wasn't alone, the precinct, once darkened by corruption, was beginning a journey toward reform. And Ethan, with Sophia by his side, stood as a testament to the enduring strength of truth, justice, and the unbreakable power of love. Justice has been served, but the fight doesn't end here. Moments like this remind us all to stand up against injustice, no matter the cost. Together, we can make a difference. What did you think of Ethan's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit.